Hawa. This is Kurimeo once again. Thanks for being here once again. Part 3 from Original American, or from the Indigenous American or Aboriginal, however you want to call it, to African American video series. In this series, we're going to talk a lot about the Mosquitoes and the Pequots and how they relate. And so, but before we get to that, I want to show some more correlating information telling us who was here originally in historical accounts. So again, if you haven't seen part 1 or 2, and if you're belly flopping, I would suggest, I would recommend you go watch part 1 and 2 just so you can see where we've been and where we're going with this series. If not, just enjoy anyways. Hope you find value in it.
When we look at, so I'm like you guys, I celebrate American history, which is our history, every month out the year. And I hope that for parents and kids that go home, now we have the internet, now we have tools at our hand. And no, you aren't being taught Black American history in schools, but now we can still go out and find that history. It's not like when we grew up and maybe it was buried someplace in the encyclopedia. All you got to do is go type in some words and you can get it right now and understand where you've come from and how special you are.
Can I just end with this one thing? These 4 brothers sitting here, we didn't all come from Africa. And there was there was a country before 1492, and our history goes way beyond 1492. So you can't start us at 1492. We were always here. We were always here. We were always here. We were always here.
This here is Aki Wensi, old man, it says, a Chippewa chief. Right here to the left we have a Missouri Indian, it says. In the middle we have an Otto Indian, and to the right we have a chief of the Punkas. As you can see, copper colored. This is a historical drawing, an official historical drawing. Here to the right we have Chief Black Thunder. Over to the left we have Arrow Walken. If you can notice his headdress, he has a symbol of the cross. This is of course pre-hijacked, before it was hijacked, the cross. It says here from left to right, Stomach Sosak, chief of the Blood Indians, Ninok Kialu, chief of the Pecans, and Homach Sakum, a Kutana Indian. This is from Carl Bodmer, 1839, Bianecki Library, Yale University, and you can see very copper colored. This right here is a Native American Chippewa warrior. It doesn't specify the name, but you can see very copper colored. So I wanted to reference William Penn here, right, and something he said about the Native Americans. And if you don't know William Penn, basically he was born in 1644 in London. He was actually the Quaker leader and advocate of religious freedom who oversaw the founding of the American Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as a refuge for Quakers and other religious minorities of Europe. So he was an important person in American history. So this William Penn, he wrote a letter in 1683, and it's this one right here. It's called A Letter from William Penn, Proprietary and Governor of Pennsylvania in America, to the Committee of the Free Society of Traders of that province residing in London, containing a general description of the said province, its soil, air, water, seasons, and produce, both natural and artificial, and the good increase thereof, of the natives or aborigines, their language, customs, and manners, diet, houses or wigwams, and so on. It says Philadelphia. And it says in the bottom, printed and sold by Andrew Soule at the Crook Billet in Holloway Lane in Shoreditch at several stationers in London in 1683. All right. So in part 5 of this letter, he is referencing the Lenape tribe he's encountering over there in the area he's settled in Pennsylvania, and he says, "These natives I shall consider in their persons, language, manners, religion, and government with my sense of their original. For their persons they are generally tall, straight, well built, and of singular proportion. They tread strong and clever, and mostly walk with a lofty chin. Of complexion, black." Again, The complexion, black, black, but by design as the gypsies in England. So we know, if we've, especially if you guys follow King Drop, the gypsies, the original gypsies were copper colored. So he's comparing them almost to the gypsies in England. They grease themselves with bear's fat, clarified, and using no defense against sun or weather. Their skin must needs be swarthy. And we remember from the first two videos, swarthy again means black, right? Especially when they're talking about skin, a dark complexion, dark black skin. Their eye is little and black, not unlike a straight look Jew. The thick lip and flat nose, so frequent with the East Indians and blacks, are not common to them, for I have seen as comely European-like faces among them of both as your side of the sea, and truly an Italian complexion has not much more of the white, and the noses of several of them have as much of the Roman. And he continues right after the last paragraph. He says here, their language is lofty, yet narrow, but like the Hebrew. Their language is like the Hebrew, in signification full like shorthand in writing. One word serveth in the place of three, and the rest are supplied by the understanding of the hearer. Imperfect in their tenses, wanting in their moods, participles, adverbs, conjunctions, interjections, I have made it my business to understand it, that I might not want an interpreter on any occasion. And I must say that I know not a language spoken in Europe that has words or more sweetness or greatness in accent and emphasis than theirs. So he's saying how their language is so great, right? So sweet, and it's like Hebrew, right? So what are we learning here? All right, what did Chris Webber mean earlier when we saw him talking about how important and special you are? Look how important and special you are. So this is a historical painting of the Lenape tribe, as you can see, doing treaty with William Penn, as you can see, copper colored. And this is a historical painting. Again, it says it's William Penn's land treaty with the Delaware Indians, 1683, taken from the painting by Paul Dunville, frontispiece from Albert Cook Myers, William Penn, his own account of the Lenape or Delaware Indians in 1683, Delaware Company, Pennsylvania, 1937, courtesy of the American Antiquarian Society, Worcester, Massachusetts. And again, how he wrote about them in the letters as black, right? Swarthy. As you can see, this painting, they drew them black or copper color, right? So-called Negro. All right. So again, this is the painting and more correlation, right? See how special you are, how far back you go. These ain't Africans. Over to the left, we have a Anishinaabe, an Ojibwe Nation Native American from 1880. Over to the right, we have a Comanche warrior. All right. Here, over to the right, we have Apsaluka group Native Americans, and over to the left, we have Blue Horse of a Lakota leader, Native American. Again, Blue Horse, Lakota. Okay, here over to the right, we have a Blackfoot chief. In the middle, we have Atabaliba, Inca, Native American, and over to the left, we have Amonse, Little B, a Chippewa chief. All right, as you can see. Over here, over to the right, we have Bad Buffalo and Bad Gun. Over to the left, we have Baby Jack, a Cree Indian. It says Howard King photograph. I'm going to read from this journal. It's called the Atlantic Journal and Friend of Knowledge, a cyclopedic journal and review of universal science and knowledge, historical, natural, and medical arts and sciences, with numerous figures. Editor C.S. Rafinsky, Professor of Historical and Natural Sciences, Volume 1, Philadelphia, from 1832. And the bottom says, knowledge is the mental food of man. And it says here, number 10, the Americans cannot have sprung from a single nation, because independently of the languages, their features and complexions are as various as in Africa and Asia. We find in America white, tawny, brown, yellow, olive, copper, and even black nations as in Africa. Right? Even black nations as in Africa. Also dwarfs and giants, handsome and ugly features, flat, aquiline noses, thick and thin lips. So thick and thin lips, and even black nations. All right. Why are they leaving out the black nations always? Why have they never taught us about the black nation? Over to the right, we have bobtail horse, a Cheyenne Native American. Over to the middle, we have Blackfoot Indian male. He's called High Eagle. And over to the left, we have Black Chest and White Calf from 1924, Mandan Native Americans. Over to the right here, we have Blue Thunder from 1911. In the middle, we have two Seneca women in their traditional dress from 1860. And over to the left, we have Al Seawolf Curtis, a Chippewa Wampanoag Native American. And here over in the left, we have Cloudman and Assiniboine, Native American from 1898. In the middle, we have Blue Chief, an Indian warrior. And over to the right, we have another copper-colored Native American couple. I wasn't able to get what tribe they were from. And this is a tribe in South America, in Suriname. This is the Carib people with the Dutch governor in Paramaribo, Suriname. As you can see, copper-colored, so-called Negroes. Alright, I'm going to read from this book. It's called The Ancient Civilizations of Mexico and Central America by Herbert J. Spinden, Assistant Curator of Anthropology. This is New York, 1917. This is from the American Museum of Natural History. It says here, the Mosquito Indians of the east coast of Nicaragua have a very considerable Negro admixture. They are fishermen of low culture. It has recently been possible to connect the original Indian stock of this unhealthy coast with other tribes who live farther inland. So the Mosquito are Negro, right? As I said there in that book before. Now the Mosquito people, they're a great example of what I'm going to be teaching later on in the later parts of these series. From Aboriginal to African American, right? Because you are Aboriginal. So the Mosquitoes, says here, are indigenous ethnic group in Central America, of whom many are mixed race. In the northern end of their territory, the people are primarily of African Native American ancestry. Others are mixed with African, Native American, and English descent. So they're calling them African, right? African. They're throwing in that word, they're African. But I'm going to show you how many times they're calling these people African, right? But they're actually coming from other parts of America. They're Native Americans. And I'm going to show you who actually shipwrecked here in the Mosquito Coast of Honduras. They were coming from Providence Island, the English Pilgrim colony. And I'm going to show you who they had as slaves there, all right? Now, regarding the origins of Mosquito, according to Wikipedia and, the hijack sources, it says, according to their early accounts, slaves traveling on a slave ship revolted and took the ship over, but wrecked it near Cape Gracias a Dios, that is in Honduras, right above Nicaragua. Though they disagree on the impact of the arrival of these Africans had on the local people and how they were received. So basically they don't really know what happened after that when they arrived, what happened there with the local people that was there, if they mix or... So we don't know, alright, that these mixed people, they don't really know what happened when they got there, so we got to dodge the hijack. So further on down it says the date and circumstances of the shipwreck are also uncertain. Bishop Garrett and Arlovy related that the shipwreck in 1641. It says a number of Africans reached the coast from shipwrecked slave ships, alright, notably one in the mid 17th century. Alright, so we got to dodge the hijack again. Dodge the hijack Africans. The survivors of shipwrecks and or escaped slaves from Providence Island colony settled around Cape Gracias a Dios. They intermarried with the indigenous people. So now they're saying that these Africans, right, that arrived at the Mosquito Coast right there in Cape Gracias a Dios, which is in Honduras, right on top of Nicaragua, said that they were from Providence Island colony. These so-called Africans were from Providence Island colony slaves, and I'm going to show you who was there in Providence Island colony. Isla De Providencia. Isla De Providencia, or Old Providence, is a mountainous Caribbean island part of the Colombian Department of Archipelago of San Andreas, Providencia, and Santa Catalina, and the municipality of Providencia and Santa Catalina Islands, lying midway between Costa Rica and Jamaica. So in between Costa Rica and Jamaica. It says the island was the site of an English Puritan colony established in 1629 by the Providence Island Company, and was briefly taken by Spain in 1641. What did we just read about the slaves arriving in the Mosquito Coast in 1641? A shipwreck of slaves, black slaves or copper colored slaves or Negroes, as we read earlier, arrived in 1641, and we see here that this island was taken by Spain in 1641 from the Puritans. They had war, they attacked. All right. The Providence Island Colony was established in 1631 by English Puritans on what is now the Colombian department of Isla De Providencia, about 200 kilometers east of the coast of Nicaragua. Although intended to be a model Puritan colony, it also functioned as a base for privateers operating against Spanish ships and settlements in the region. Alright, so these privateers, if you start doing the research, they turn out to be pirates. They call them privateers, but they were pirates working for the English government or king queen to basically pirate Spanish ships, like attack Spanish ships, just like the Pirate of the Caribbean movie, and take all their goods. That includes human cargo, unfortunately, and that was Native Americans, as we're going to see later on. The Spanish ships was taking numerous, Spanish and Portuguese, numerous Native American people from all over South America, Newfoundland, up in North America, in Canada, Nova Scotia, from South Carolina. They had ports in Cartagena in Colombia. They had ports in Florida and Hispaniola, in Jamaica, Bermuda, and so they were, basically raiding these ships and taking their slaves. So sometimes it happened the opposite way, as we see in here. It says in 1641 the Spanish overran and destroyed the colony. So in 1641 the Spanish arrived and attacked, and we read earlier that the Negroes that arrived in Mosquito Coast, or the Mosquito people, were from basically slaves that ran away from Providence Island, and we see why now, because the Spanish attacked. So who were these slaves that the Puritans had? Who were these Negroes that the Puritans had? These pilgrims. These are the same people. 1620s when the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts. This was established in 1631. And through the Providence Island Company, which you'll see is the same as the Pilgrims and the Massachusetts Bay Company. So let's see who they had actually, these Providence Island Colony, who they had as slaves. And from the book Providence Island, 1630 to 1641, the other Puritan Colony by Karen Cooperman. We're going to get this excerpt right here. It says, the Spanish found Providence Island well provided with arms and ammunition, including 60 pieces of heavy artillery and a great deal of equipment stockpiled for the attempt to colonize the Mosquito Coast. The island was inhabited by 381 slaves who were sold at Cartagena and Portobello by order of the king, and about 350 English settlers, including some formerly on San Andreas and elsewhere, who had consolidated on Providence Island after the 1640 attack. So just to stop right there real quick, it says basically this is the account of the Spanish arriving that day of attacking Providence Island, the Puritans, right? And it says that they were heavily armed and that they actually were planning to go colonize the Mosquito Coast. These Puritans, they were going to the Mosquito Coast probably already back and forth, right? And it says that the slaves, or the people that they had there, were sold in Cartagena, Colombia. So they grabbed some of the Puritan slaves and sold them in Cartagena and Colombia after that. It says that continues, says the number of slaves was much lower than the Spanish expected. They learned that the English, fearful of rebellion, had dispersed many of their slaves to St. Christopher's and Bermuda. So they had sent many of their slaves to other islands, the Puritans, right? Now they were bringing these slaves from Massachusetts. I'm going to show you. Watch. 18th century accounts of the Mosquito Coast hold that the ship manned by the rebelling slaves was wrecked south of Cape Gracias a Dios in 1641. Again, that was in Honduras, and that's where the so-called slaves, or so-called Africans, were shipwrecked, right, in 1641, and they were from Providence Island, Puritan slaves that they had escaped. It says these memoirs differ on the escapees' origin. So they still really don't know the origin, right? The theory is that they were fleeing from Providence Island as it fell to the Spanish, All accounts agreed that the newcomers melded into the native population. Alright, so as you can see, more correlation that they were coming from Providence Island after the Spanish had invaded and attacked the Puritans. So it was the slaves of the Puritans who fled. Alright, so I just wanted to give you a reference of where you can find Providence Island or Isla De Providencia. So you can see where the red marker is. That's basically the island. And right behind, under it, or right next to it, you see Nicaragua. Right under, you see Costa Rica. Above it, a little bit towards the northeast, you'll see Jamaica. So right in between Costa Rica and Jamaica, right next to Nicaragua. So there was a Pilgrim Puritan colony here in the 1600s. 1629 they arrived. You said that. You heard that, right? And then 1631 they established the colony. All right. So did you know that the Pilgrims had another colony all the way down here in Central America? And you know who they were bringing, right? I'm going to show you who they were bringing down here as slaves. So you can see up towards the northwest, you see Gracias a Dios. That's basically where the shipwreck landed supposedly, and Gracias a Dios more towards the shore. And so you can get a little reference. So let's read a little bit more about Isla de Providencia. It says here in this book, Brethren by Nature, New England Indians, Colonists, and the Origins of American Slavery. So we're going to jump to this part of the book. It says here, the rapid entry of Indians into the labor market in other English colonies in the late 1620s and the 1630s exposed this gap. The anomalous status of Indians as laboring groups that occupied a legal gray area between servants of European origins and African slaves attracted attention and legislation a year before the Pequot conflict, all right? In Barbados and Providence Island, all right, Providence Island, right? Two colonies with close ties to New England. All right, so there was Indians being enslaved over there, and they were having trouble. They're saying that between making them or like servants, like the European origin ones, like white people being treated as servants, or like slaves, total slaves, like African slaves. They're saying. So it says Pequot and Manicean captives exported out of New England in the 1630s entered an Atlantic world where Indians already composed a significant proportion of the agriculture and public works and infrastructure labor force. So you're seeing they were sending out Pequot and Manicean captives, right? Continuing, says they joined Caribs and Arawaks. So they're talking about the Pequot and the Manicean. They joined Caribs and Arawaks from the Caribbean islands, Guyana, and Venezuela. Mosquitoes and members of smaller groups raided by the Mosquitoes from Central America, and Indians from northern Mexico and South America traded through Gracias de Dios. So they had a trading colony there of Indians in Honduras where the shipwreck landed, right? And they're telling you that there was already Mosquitoes there when the Pequots were being sent, all right? They were joining them, it says. A port on the coast between present-day Nicaragua and Honduras that we just mentioned. It says Indian captives from this western rim region also moved to and through Jamaica, which served as a hub of the region's labor market. Alright, so Indians, alright, not Africans. By the 1640s, the Dutch in New York and the English in Virginia exported Indian captives to Curacao, Bermuda, and Barbados. Alright. Continuing, on the Puritan colony of Providence Island, organized by many of the same figures who backed the Massachusetts Bay Company, despite early efforts to limit African slavery and to prohibit Indian slavery, the slave population exploded after 1634, and slaves outnumbered English colonists by the end of the decade. So they were going crazy with it, enslaving these Indians. Providence Island Company officials and investors differed somewhat on the length and heritability of slave status. Once eminent counselor named Samuel Richworth, who supported the rights of the English servants against company and planter exploitation, also attacked slavery vehemently as incompatible with godly aims and encouraged slaves to rebel. But in practice, by 1634, most planters expected slaves to work for life and claimed ownership of the children of non-European workers. Again, a crucial distinction between slavery and servitude. Alright, so they're talking about that, first so-called slaves were actually indentured servants. I'm going to talk about this later on. We're going to get to that. But just wanted to bring this out first so you can get your feet wet with it. And as he's explaining, they were, arguing what they should do because they were basically enslaving these Indians for life when they were supposed to be just servants. They had a contract due. All right. Such was the demand for labor that despite two major slave revolts and the presence of stiff Maroon community, the government refused to let inhabitants who left the island for any reason take enslaved workers with them because they were needed for construction of public defense projects as well as agricultural work. A Captain Bell did receive permission to sell his plantation and leave with his Indian woman, wife, and Negroes in 1638. Possibly Bell's Indian was a New England captive, alright? A New England captive, alright, from New England. In one of the only surviving documents that mentions the Pequots in May 1638, the company's officials warned the governor of Providence Island that we would have the cannibal Negroes from New England inquired after, whose they are and special care taken of them. So first of all, let's stop there. Look what they're saying. They're saying that there's an official document that mentions that the Pequot in 1638, they were in Providence Island. They were being sent there. If we know the story of the Pequot War with the English and the Puritans, we'll see that they after they had lost, they were enslaved and sent to the West Indies and even to Cape Verde. All right, in the South, they were sent to other colonies of English colonies. So it says here that we would have the cannibal Negroes from New England inquired after, whose they are and special care taken of them. They said that they need to be taken care of because if you know the stories of the Pequots, they were really rebellious. They wouldn't go down without a fight. They never ceased to fight. They were actually beaten and sent enslaved. They never made treaty towards the end. And just in case if you didn't capture that, they're referring to the Pequots as cannibal Negroes, right? They call them the Pequots Negroes. So who's really arriving to the Mosquito Coast? Who were these slaves? Africans, so-called, right? They were Pequots. And just to correlate with the Pequot being, rebellious, it says here in this book, Dictionary of American Indian Place and Proper Names in New England, says here the Pequots were, if not the most numerous, the most formidable, as well as the fiercest and bravest of the Aborigines of Connecticut. They, together with the Mohegans, belonged originally to the same race as the Mohicanders or Machanders, who resided on the banks of the Hudson. And so you can see that they're warning. So it says, but given slave unrest, these worries seem excited by security concerns rather than humanitarian ones. Company and island officials were worried about the captives fomenting rebellion or forging relationships with existing Indian and Maroon communities. This is the first mention of what would become a stereotype in English Atlantic Caribbean correspondence and legislation in the 17th century, that New England Indians were particularly troublesome and prone to rebellion. No direct evidence that the Pequots or later the Wampanoag or Narragansetts were involved in slave revolts or rebellion has appeared in colonial records. Yet these official concerns resurfaced in the 1640s and the 1670s in times of slave revolt and insecurity. So again, you can see that they were having trouble keeping these Pequot tribal native aboriginals in check, and they were fighting to the end, even in their slave colonies down there in Providence Island. And eventually, we already know what happened when the Spanish came. They probably saw the opportunity and bounced and went to the coast, or the Mosquito Coast, all right, and shipwrecked there, it says, right? The diaspora of Indians out of New England followed the patterns of New England's trade routes and partners, which linked the region closely to Bermuda, Virginia, Barbados, Providence Island, and eventually Jamaica. So again, Providence Island, all right? So it says that it followed there. After the English conquest, colonies where slavery flourished by the 1640s. Within a few years, these networks included the Canaries, the Azores, Madeira, and Cape Verde, as I mentioned earlier. We're going to see the prevalence of Cape Verde later on and the whole African transatlantic slave trades, the so-called African transatlantic slave trade. We're going to see its importance there. And ports on the Mediterranean, as New England ships took barrels, staves, and fish, and local Indians. They took local Indians to these places in Cape Verde, Mediterranean, Canaries, Azores, and Madeira, it says, to trade for wine, which they in turn exchanged for Africans on the Guinea coast in Barbados. And we're going to learn later where this Guinea coast is, and basically the reference in Cape Verde and the same islands, the Canaries, the Azores, Madeira. So they weren't really grabbing Africans. I'll show you who they were grabbing there as well. Captain Powell, who ferried Henry Winthrop to and from Barbados, was a Puritan who battled against Stuart sympathizers in Barbados and also transported European laborers and eventually Africans and Indians to the island as workers, including the original Guyanese Arawaks. And continuing with this Mosquito Pequot relation, it says, Belize tracking the past of its history from the heart of the Mayan Empire by Renee Johanna Mayer. I want to show you how we're going to catch them on the lie right here. You know, when they tell us that Africans arrived in the Honduran coast in 1641 from a shipwreck, and that's how they became so-called Negro, these tribes that they're finding there that are copper colored. So in this book it says the first European contacts with the Mosquito coast date back to the beginnings of the 17th century. In the 1630s, the region was a strategic place for traders, pirates, buccaneers to engage in contraband and to prey on Spanish ships. Again, you see, these privateers were actually pirates, remember? They were setting up, their colony was just a front to enslaved Indians. That's what it turns, and they were trying to take them from these Spanish ships, as you can see here, to prey on Spanish ships, because the Spanish were the ones enslaving all the Indians and doing all the exporting from Hispaniola and all the other places they had, the Spanish and the Portuguese. So they wanted a piece of the pie, these English, and they used the Puritans as a front, because the first Puritan, the Earl of Warwick, you'll see who he was. In 1631, the Puritans from the Providence Company established a first settlement in the vicinity of Cape Gracias a Dios and began to engage in trade with the natives. So in 1631 they were already in Gracias de Dios, trading with the natives. That's where the shipwreck supposedly arrived, right? From 1641 onwards, the Spanish extinguished the short-lived Puritan colony of Old Providence. The Puritan colonists who succeeded in escaping to the mainland started to found tentative settlements along the coast. Together with the Puritans came their African slaves, and we already know what they're talking about. We're African. Where's the records? They had Pequot Indian slaves that were bringing from the English colonies of North America. And what I also wanted to highlight for you is that it's telling us right here that after the Spanish came and attacked Providence Island, that the Puritans escaped and they brought their slaves to the coast of these places like Gracias a Dios, the Mosquito coast. So it wasn't just shipwrecked Africans that rebelled and took over a ship. No, these were actually coming with the Puritans. So were they still slaves when they were arriving in the Mosquito coast? That's what it appears like, because they were there since 1631. Right? They were doing trade and business with the local natives since the 1630s. The Puritans knew about this area, so they went over there after they got attacked and they took some of their slaves. So were they really shipwrecked slaves? Look how they word everything in history, and look how they kind of throw us off. If we don't do the research, we won't really know what exactly was going on, but there's records that is telling us other stories. All right, so let's continue. Continuing, it says, apart from the slaves that accompanied the Puritans from Old Providence, dodge the hijack, right? I'm talking about Native Americans. The majority of Africans arrived at the Mosquito coast after having been shipwrecked, right? Africans, so-called Africans. Historical references speak of a number of slave ships and different dates, but no details are given as to how many actually reached the mainland. So you see, they're just making up things. Alright, the Spanish failure to gain significant influence in the region gave the English carte blanche to occupy and found settlements on the Mosquito coast. Due to the fruitless missionary attempts to found reductions, the Sambo Miskito as well as other indigenous tribes were left relatively undisturbed, and it was at this time when the first informal alliance with the English were formed. Okay. When the Puritan settlers who succeeded in escaping the massive Spanish attack on Providence Island in 1641 went to the mainland, they gradually started to intermarry with the Sambo Mosquito. So Sambo Mosquito already existed, alright? and or various indigenous coastal tribes. In exchange for conjugal arrangements, they were given metal tools and arms, muskets, to defend themselves against their common enemy, the Spaniards. The harmonious relationship between the Mosquito and the English and the institution of a kingdom was for the benefit of both parties concerned. In view of the fact that maintaining good relations with the kingdom could prove to be useful in the future, the Earl of Warwick, here we go. This is Robert Rich, I believe his name is, his real name, and he was the first Puritan hero of the rebellion they had in England. He's the Earl of Warwick. He had a lot of uh, input in the so-called transatlantic slave trade. It says the Earl of Warwick of the Providence Company invited the Mosquito chief's son to London in 1632. So they told us that the Mosquito were made. If you remember from Wikipedia, right here, as you can see here, it tells us that the Mosquito are of African and native descendants. So if so as you can see, way before 1641, the Mosquito already existed as a tribe. They weren't there from African slaves, first of all, because we know the Puritans had Pequot Indians, and if so, they're talking about a mixture of the local tribes that were there in Nicaragua and Honduras with Pequot or New England or English colony Indian slaves that they were bringing down, not Africans. And supposedly the shipwrecks didn't happen until 1641, so they were already bringing the Mosquito chief's son to London in 1632. Way before that, they already existed as a tribe. So when we gotta dodge the hijacks. All right. Upon the death of his father, and became king, initiating the line of hereditary Mosquito kings loyal to the British crown. All right. Now, talking about being loyal to the British crown, right? The Mosquitoes and the English, right? Working together. Not to get sidetracked or off the subject, but this book has some information which correlates to what we're learning about the Mosquito. This is from the Proceedings of the 8th American Scientific Congress, held in Washington, May 10 to the 18th, 1940. Under the auspices of the Government of the United States of America, Volume 2, Anthropological Sciences, Department of State, Washington, 1942. Alright, so it says here, The Sigua, Southernmost Aztec Outpost, by S.K. Lothrop, Assistant Curator of the Middle American Archaeology in Peabody Museum, Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Says the fact that an Aztec colony existed in northwestern Panama in the 16th century has been known to scholars for over half a century, but the curious history of this group, scattered through various documentary sources, has never been brought together. As the vicissitudes of the Sigua typify larger movements of population and what must have been the fate of many other native tribes during the colonial period, we shall follow the course of events which carried them from Anahuac to Panama and ultimately to the island of Jamaica. So when they say northwestern Panama, they're also including the southeastern part of southeastern part of Costa Rica, which is the border, and that's the Talamanca Native American region. It's called Talamanca. Alright, so as you can see here, it says some Aztecs went all the way down to Panama, Costa Rica, and ultimately to the islands of Jamaica. Alright, so let's continue. Some Aztecs. And continuing a little ahead in this article regarding the Sigua, right, the Aztecs that made it down over to Panama and Costa Rica, it says, at this time, yet there had arisen in the Caribbean a new political power, which soon was destined to destroy the Sigua, a feat which Spaniards had failed to accomplish in nearly 2 centuries of intermittent warfare. This was the kingdom of the Mosquitoes. Again, the Mosquitoes, here we go. We know about the Mosquitoes, right? The history of the Mosquitoes is briefly as follows. In 1641, a shipload of Negro slaves under charge of the Portuguese named Lorenzo Gramalcho was wrecked on an island known as Mosquitoes off the coast of Nicaragua. So now you see, first they told us in Wikipedia and all these other sources that they don't really know the origin of these so-called slaves, but this document from Harvard actually is telling us that it was from a Portuguese. They were from a Portuguese, I guess, ship. There's no mention here of these so-called Negroes taking over the ship and rebelling like we've learned in Wikipedia, but we've learned so many accounts there, and they admit that they don't really know which one's the most accurate. I mean, here Harvard could be just trying to create a story to explain these Negroes on this coast as well. Now, this is saying something totally different from what we just learned, because we know that the Puritans, when they were attacked by Spanish in Providence Island, they went to Gracias a Dios in 1641 and supposedly shipwrecked there, the Indians. So why is this telling us a different story now? Continuing, it says, most of these Negroes escaped and organized as an army. They conquered various native tribes. With the women of the conquered, the victors rapidly increased in numbers, creating a mixed race. Encouraged by the English in Jamaica, who formally recognized a Mosquito king, right? We just read that, right? They took him to London in 1632, right? The king, and it was the Puritans, the Pilgrims from Providence Island. Right here, it's telling us English from Jamaica. It's telling us different things here, but we know we can dodge some of the hijack and read other accounts and know that they're exactly talking about the Pilgrim Puritans, all right, that were in Providence Island and also had, of course, colonies in Jamaica probably. Says they raided Spanish and Indian settlements. All right, so the Mosquitoes, helping the English, raided Spanish and Indian settlements. The Spanish were enslaving thousands of Native Americans, so they were taking their Native Americans and selling the men to the English as slaves and keeping the women for themselves. So they were selling these Native American copper-colored tribes, right? We know what's over here, copper-colored so-called Negro tribes, and giving them to the English. The English, in turn, would take them to their English colonies. Yes, English colonies in America, and up there in Massachusetts. Remember, they said they were trading for the Pequots. They would say that they trade in Pequots for Africans. They would send some Pequots down from Massachusetts to the Caribbean and supposedly buy and bring up some Africans, right? That's what we're going to learn later. But we know this account from Harvard is that they were helping, the English, these Mosquito tribes, raid Spanish and Indian settlements, selling the men to English as slaves and keeping the women for themselves. These depredations were extended as far north as the Petén and southward to Chiriquí and Portobello. Plans for the extermination of the Mosquitoes were drawn up as early as 1711 and 1714, but nothing seems to have been accomplished. I guess this is what the Spanish wanted. And in 1720, the king ordered the Spanish minister in England to make formal protests over the sale of Spanish subjects as slaves in Jamaica. So basically, what they is saying here is that they were complaining, the Spanish, that they were actually selling their own captives, because they were stealing them from them and then going to Jamaica and selling them there. So they were taking them from the Spanish were doing all the work of capturing them, and so the English were using the Mosquito to go grab some so-called Negro slaves and sell them in Jamaica. Because where's all these descendants? If they look like the so-called Native Americans of today, why does the population of Jamaica, why is it mostly copper-colored? We're gonna keep hearing of the accounts of Indians being brought to Jamaica, to all these Caribbean parts, Hispaniola, and we're gonna see, we see today who's there. So where's all the descendants if they looked light skinned, right? But these are all so-called Negroes. They're enslavement. So this is black on black. It goes way back. They had help. That's the only way they could have invaded you and your ancestors, because they had help. All right, so let's continue. So we're gonna read here how the Mosquito did this to the Sigua, right? That the Sigua, it says, were taken in these raids comes to light as a result of an investigation ordered by the Spanish crown in 1722. The governor of Costa Rica, Don Diego de la Haya Fernandez, Heya, reported on the 30th of September that over 2,000 Indians had been taken from the island of Tohar and the adjacent mainland. The greater part of these had been exchanged in Jamaica for guns and munitions, iron and steel, and coarse clothing, which traffic is current every year. So you can see this account, how many they took over from this area of Costa Rica and Panama, which were the Sigua, which were actually Aztecs, right? This is Aztecs, Mexica, right? Who are the Mexica coming all the way from Aztlan in Utah? And as you know, if you don't know, this is, you know, if you can remember, Aztecs are copper colored tribes. We've read about it in the other books and the other parts, and we've seen depictions of Aztecs from this area in Mexico. So, you know, we're talking about copper colored people being enslaved by the thousands, right, and sent to Jamaica for guns and munitions. Alright, it says here by another copper colored tribe, the Mosquitoes, helping the English Puritans do this. And who was in charge of this whole Puritan Providence Island company? The Earl of Warwick. We're gonna get to him. You're gonna see how important he is in this whole transatlantic slave trade, right? The Earl of Warwick, the Puritan hero. And just to finish up with this article, it says here, this island is very fertile and abounds in fruits such as plantains, pineapples, etc. They're talking about these islands off the coast of Panama and Costa Rica where these Sigua were living after a while, because they had fled the mainland because they were getting attacked since they were foreigners to the local people there, because they're Aztecs. They moved to the islands. So it says, but as I am informed, it is already deserted on account of the repeated invasions which have been made by the Sambos and Mosquitoes, in league with the English, who carry away the people, selling the men in Jamaica and making use of the women. The few that are left have withdrawn into the hills, where they have their settlements or palenques. So this is telling us, this document from Harvard, saying that there was actually a few that stayed in the hills. These Aztec tribes stayed here. Copper colored tribe stayed here, and this other copper colored tribe, right, these Sambos, if you look up the word Sambos, it's going to tell you it's all African, but you can see here these were Native Americans. These were already here in 1630 when the Puritans arrived there. They made deals with them. They were already a tribe. All right, so continuing, just want to show you what kind of people and these days live in this area of Costa Rica, down here in this region of Talamanca and southern Costa Rica, or northwestern, and the whole coast of Panama, and these islands called Bocas del Toro, because this is one of the islands they're talking about in these articles. These are the kind of people that are over there right now. As you can see, copper colored people. It's you know, the stories they tell us is that these are Jamaican ancestors that were brought here in the 1800s to build the railroads, to help with the plantations of bananas and the railroads and the coffee and all that, and the chocolate, but mostly railroads. And they do speak Patois. They do as a type of Patois, right, Creole English. But as you can see, what first account is there, which way? So we're seeing that they actually were sent from Costa Rica to Jamaica first. And maybe, yeah, there was, the English kept using these same people, these same tribes, these same indigenous people back and forth from there, because they say they brought them in the 1800s again. But who were they bringing? Who was already over there from the 1600s by the thousands? Were they bringing some of them back? Or other tribes that they had enslaved in other parts of South America and America? Remember, Jamaica was the hub, we read earlier, of the slave trade of Native Americans. Alright, so I just wanted to leave you with that. So let's continue with the Pequot, as we were talking earlier, right? That they were being sent to Providence Island. Alright, so let's continue. Alright, now, so just to finish up with what I've been trying to explain to you and show you, hopefully make you realize, is how they lie to us in history books, and they always just tell us without even referencing anything, just throwing words at us like Africans and Africans and Africans, West Africans, and they're really talking about this whole time was Native Americans they were enslaving. So as it says here, forging new communities, Indian slavery and servitude in colonial New England, 1676-1776, by Bernard J. Lillis, class of 2012. This is a thesis submitted to the faculty of the Wesleyan University in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Bachelor of Arts with Department Honors in History, from April 2012. In light of the general native practice, particularly following the devastating epidemics of the early 17th century, of fully incorporating captives into native kingship networks and communities. Williams then proposes that given the danger of the Pequot might be false to the English, it would be best if they be settled on some island, using an island which Mayantonomo would have been familiar with off the coast of New England as an example. So they're saying again, they're correlating how rebellious the Pequot are, and having them too close might be dangerous in their native land. So what they did, they decided to send them off far away or to another island. And in other references, they say that they traded the Pequots for African slaves, but we know they were just trading for other Native Americans and bringing them up to New England and bringing down the Pequot so they can have more control over them, right? It says the islands which William must have had in mind, and where in fact a number of Pequot captives were sent, were the British slave colonies in the Caribbean, Bermuda, or the short-lived Puritan slave colony of Providence Island. This makes Mayantonomo's agreement on the basis that shipping slaves out of New England would prevent them from having to break up their families tragically ironic. By the end of July, at least one shipment of 17 Pequot captives had been sent to the West Indies on the ship Desiree. In 1638, the Desiree returned after a 7-month voyage, bringing cotton, tobacco, salt, and African slaves. Dodge the hijack. Alright, so you see what these slaves were in the Providence Island that escaped, and they're so-called Negro and Negro cannibals. They're calling them Negro, and they're actually Pequot Native Americans that lost the war against the Puritans in Massachusetts. They were enslaved. They were sent to the West Indies, and one of these places was Providence Island. In other accounts, if you do the research, you'll see that they were trying to head to Bermuda and it steered off course, and it actually went all the way to Providence Island and dumped all the Pequot captives there. So do the research, people, because in the next video we're going to start getting into this whole enslavement of the indigenous American, the Native American, and you're going to see how that, we know already that it was it's copper colored tribes, right? And we know what happened to the so-called Negro in America. We know all about slavery, or we think we do, right? But we're going to find out it was Native Americans. Alright, as this was a perfect example of how they switch words around, and they tell us, well, this tribe is Negro because of that. Well, this tribe is Negro because of that. Shipwrecked Africans, or Africans who came before Columbus, they got lost. Or they'll make something up, they'll always add African to it because they want to throw you off. But if you do the research and you dig into it, you'll find that historical accounts are saying something else. And there is no historical accounts telling me straight up that these Puritans had Africans from West Africa, whatever country they were getting them from supposedly, and bringing them straight to Providence Island, and then from there selling them, or from there the Africans escaping and going into the Mosquito coast and becoming the Mosquitoes. We just debunked all that. Hopefully you saw that. So we have hundreds of accounts of Native Americans being enslaved, thousands of them being enslaved. And since we're talking about relating this to the Pilgrims, right? Well, in New England, thousands of them were enslaved, and there's many accounts of that as well. So let's look into the Pequot tribe now. They could not endure that joke. The Captivity of the Pequot Women and Children After the War of 1637 by Michael L. Fix, the New England Quarterly Journal article, volume 73, number 1, March 2000, pages 58 to 81. And jump into this part of the journal. It says, after the swamp battle, he reported in his journal the English forces had captured and killed about 700 Pequots. Earlier he had noted the deaths of about 400 Pequots. The resultant estimate of 300 living captive Pequots conforms to the combined totals 319 reported by the various chroniclers of the war. The colonists quickly transported one captive to England and 17 more to the Providence Island over in Nicaragua, Caribbean. Although others may have been shipped out of New England immediately, no evidence survives to verify the conjecture. However, if only 280 Pequot captives remained with Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Plymouth, they would have boosted the colony's combined total. It says here, so So it says here there's no evidence of other Pequots being taken over there, but we read earlier already, these Native American tribal people were being enslaved and outnumbered English in their colonies. That was including Providence Island, and we also read that the Spanish, when they got there, they said there was around 381 slaves, and that they thought there would be more, but they found out that because the English were afraid of these uprising of these Pequot rebellious tribal people uprising, they would send them to other parts, other islands, to separate them, to have more control over them. So we gotta dodge the hijack every time. You see how it says there's no evidence, and then they tell us only 17 went over there? They'll give us the truth, but they won't give us the whole truth in one whole book. We gotta go looking around in different parts. All right, so just wanted to mention that. So let's continue. So on the bottom of this page, on the footnote, from what we just read, it says Winthrop Journal. Colonial authorities intended to send these captives to Bermuda. Instead, a navigational error resulted in their delivery to Providence Island. Ethel Bossivane claims that Pequots were shipped to Bermuda in 1640 and after 1650. In drawing this conclusion, she relies on the works of James E. Smith and Van Wyck Mason. However, Mason and Smith failed to provide any specific documentation of Pequot slavery in Bermuda. They only cite sources that contain references to Indians of unknown and non-New England origins. So it says, see Bossavane, whatever became of the New England Indians shipped to Bermuda to be sold as slaves. Man in the Northeast, 1981, and Smith, Slavery in Bermuda. New York Vintage Press, 1976, or the Van Wyck Mason's book, Bermuda's Pequots, Harvard Alumni Bulletin from 1937. So what happened to these New England Indians that were shipped to Bermuda? They ended up in Providence Island, and then from there, what did they do? They escaped, the ones that didn't get killed, and they went over to the Miskito coast, right? Gracias de Dios, port in Honduras. Chapter 2, The First Slaves, an artist's rendering of a scene at the 1937 massacre of the Pequot Ford and Mystic River, and that's in Massachusetts. As you can see what they did to them. So let's see what chapter 2 of this book says. It says, out of a swampy thicket near the blue waters of Long Island Sound, 200 old men, women, and children stepped into the bright sunshine and entered a new world. Hundreds of edgy soldiers, mustered from villages and farms across Connecticut, had finally surrounded the Pequots and their leader, Sasa Ku. So it says finally, they were having trouble with these Pequots, Indians. It was July 13th, 1937, a critical day in the Pequot War that had consumed Puritan Connecticut for several years. So you hear? They were having trouble with these Pequot rebels for several years. 6 weeks before, in a key victory for the colonists, Captain John Mason had led a massacre of the Pequot Fort and Mystic, killing as many as 700 Indians in a single hour. Tragic. This summer afternoon was a jubilant one for the Puritans and their Mohegan scouts who had cornered these most terrible Pequots, most terrible to them because they were having trouble with them, right? They were getting murdered by them. A new chapter in American history was about to begin. Indian enslavement in colonial America. Alright, you hear that? A new chapter in American history. The enslavement of the Indians. Among the Pequots caught in the bog in what's now part of Fairfield, a group of perhaps 17 most likely children were thought to have been exported as slaves. Others were handed out to soldiers as wartime booty. Historians believe that these 17 Pequot later ended up on an island off of Nicaragua. Boom, there you go. Nicaragua, the Mosquitoes. Like many of the Indian slaves sent from America over the next century, there is little record of what happened to them. Alright, so little record of what happened to them, or they don't want us to correlate. That this island off the coast of Nicaragua where they're talking about is actually Providence Island. We know that already. And the Providence Island had Pequot slaves, and it was attacked in 1641 by Spanish, and the Puritans with their Pequot slaves went over to Gracias a Dios and became intermingled supposedly with the Mosquito natives, or enslaved some more there, because the Mosquitoes were loyal to the English crown, as we know, and helped them enslave other Native Americans by the thousands. Alright, so they telling us there's no record of what happened to them because they don't want you to know all that. Continuing, it says, barely 5 years after their first recorded contact with Europeans, This final battle of the bloody Pequot War conclusively finished a doomed experiment by Indians and Puritans to live side by side. By the time the Treaty of Hartford was signed the following September, formally ending the war, the English had killed or enslaved more than 1,500 Pequot men, women, and children, scholars believe. During the uneasy decades that followed, as the Puritans pushed deeper into Indian country and their numbers swelled, it was difficult to travel through Connecticut, Massachusetts, or Rhode Island and not encounter an Indian slave. Alright, again, not encounter an Indian slave. Working in a field, orchard, or boat yard. Alright, a plantation or a boat yard. By the end of the 1600s, there were probably thousands of Indian slaves, many of them servants in home and on farms, indentured servitude. It would become, in the words of Roger Williams, a founder of Brown University, an essential component of the unnecessary wars and cruel destructions of the Indians in New England. So again, the Pequot are a great example of how they were enslaved, and later on taken to another place where from there in historical accounts they are called Africans. Alright, so all of a sudden they became Africans, but we read earlier that they were called cannibal Negroes, so they did reference the Pequot as Negroes. They were being brought to Providence Island after the war finished, and from there they eventually arrived to the Mosquito coast in Honduras and supposedly became the Mosquitoes and supposedly were of African descent, but we see this is Native American indigenous people, not from Africa. And these are some modern Pequot tribal members, as you can see, copper colored. We gotta dodge the hijack sometimes, but in general, copper colored. All right. As you can see, Pequot right here, it says their lost native language of Massachusetts is waking up again. What is Bermuda's connection to the Pequot? And we already know from what we read. So as you can see in the records, they were calling them cannibal Negroes. As you can see, they are Negroes still. These are modern day Pequots. All right, remember that. Things they don't teach us. These tribes exist. All right, and we know that before they were also copper colored. All right.
Deep in the jungles of French Guiana, Mr. Herman Jessen, the Amazon trader, makes his way up the Moroni River, aided by friendly natives.
So now I want to show you this video I found on YouTube from the indigenous South American Bushman Indians, it says, from Guyana. This is rare 1950s footage. You can see, you will see copper colored tribes there.
And now, here's the man you saw in the film earlier, Mr. Herman Jessen. We're proud to have you with us, Mr. Jessen.
Thank you, John.
I'd like to ask, first of all, sir, how remote are these Indians from civilization?
These Indians live about 250 miles up the Moroni River. It's very hard to get up there because the rains endanger any trip, and the river is either too low or too high. It's just in July that one can penetrate into those villages.
Oh, is this your first trip into this area?
No, into this area it's my second trip, but I've made 25 trips into South America so far, and I expect to leave very shortly on another one.
Well, we're all anxious to see what being an Amazon trader really means, so let's start now.
Alright, so he basically starts talking, describing what he's doing in this footage. This is, I guess, some local Native Americans that joined him on this expedition to the interior of the Amazon. He says, he tells the person that's interviewing him that he travels for about 2 months and a total of 500 miles in. 500 miles in. And you can see all the footage he's getting. This is a native boy. There it says, one of the Bushman's son. This is one of the chiefs. He said he's being introduced. This is one of the chiefs that actually traded clothes with the white guy, and he dressed like the chief as well. These are more natives in these towns he's encountering along the river, as you can see. Very much so you would think you were looking at footage from Africa, but this is in French Guiana, right, in South America. And if we look at the tobacco, the old tobacco images of the Indians, right, with their feathers, copper colored bodies. It's the same as we see here. So again, he traveled through all this river 500 miles in, and he encountered, I guess, a lot. It was like an adventure for him, right? Indiana Jones. But as you can see the footage, these are so-called Negroes, right? And they gonna always tell us that these are Africans that mixed when they were escaped and maroons and stuff. But we've seen in video 1, video 2, we've seen the scientific anthropology to show that the oldest bones found here were of Negro descent. They had Negro features and resemble a lot of the Australian Aborigines and South Pacific Asians or Malays, right? And you can see them doing their dance here. They do the foot. Almost a lot of Native American tribes in the north, dance with their feet as well. They stomp their feet. And the guy, when he's explaining this part, he's saying that it sounds like merengue, cha-cha-cha, like a merengue cha-cha-cha, where they're dancing, where they're singing and drumming. According to him, this is his account from the interview. I took the audio off because it had background music. I didn't want to get a copyright strike or the video taken down. But you can find the YouTube down in the links, video originals. You can hear what he's saying. He's gonna mention a lot of Africanized, and they sound so African because that's all he knows, right, from his history. But as you can see, they're encountering different colored tribes along these rivers. As you can see, this tribe has longer hair. They let their hair grow, but they're copper colored, almost the same as the other natives that are with him. Basically almost the same skin. And this is more of them in their river. More villages they're encountering, all copper colored people, as you can see here. And chopping wood. He's saying how strong they are, how well fit they are, how they are like very natural people. They're very healthy. They they're he says they don't steal. They're very good people. They treated him like royalty when he was in their towns. They're over here fishing in this river. He says you gotta be careful because there's piranhas. As you can see, they're fishing with their harpoons and everything. And so this is, I guess, when they're almost back after the journey. He says they're unloading all the stuff they got and traded with. I guess he's gonna bring it back to Europe, where he's from. So as you can see, copper colored tribes in South America. We gotta dodge the hijacks. Aboriginals, the true Aboriginals were copper colored in America. Alright, so I'm gonna end part 3 right here. That was a lot of information. I don't want to give you too much. I want you to be awake. So we're gonna come back strong on part 4. Hope you stay tuned, and I hope you've been paying attention. We're gonna get to some good parts now. We're gonna talk about the first so-called Africans in Jamestown, Virginia. We're going to talk about this whole illegal beginnings of the slavery that we know, which started out as indentured servitude. And we're also going to start correlating with all the enslavement that happened in the United States and in the Caribbean, Central America, and South America as early as 1400s, and how these Native Americans were being brought to places like West Africa, Cape Verde, the Azores, Canaries, and even being brought back from there and then called African. Alright, so stay tuned, stay blessed, and the time has come. Hawa.